Alright, the previous video that you watched was a review of factoring, and factoring is going to come in really helpful when we're actually solving quadratic equations. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but the first way, because we do have more than one way to solve a quadratic equation, the first way we're going to do it is by graphing. So you'll see on your screen you've got the quadratic equation y equals x squared minus 4x plus 3, and then you'll see the grid over there on the right. Now there's a couple things we can do. In order to graph it, we certainly need to find our vertex first. And we can do that, and this is something that we've done many times before. We can do that by finding the axis of symmetry first, negative b over 2a. So in this case that would be negative 4 or over 2 times 1. That would be 4 over 2, and that would be x equals 2. That is our axis of symmetry, and it's also the x-coordinate of our vertex. So at 2 on the x-axis, you would have a vertical line, and that is your axis of symmetry. And now we can find the y-coordinate by simply taking that 2 and plugging it back into the original equation. So I have 2 squared minus 4 times 2 plus 3. And you can do that in your calculator exactly as it's written. There's no need to do this all on your own, but you end up with negative 1 when you figure that out, or when you do that in your calculator. Okay? That negative 1 is the y-coordinate of your vertex. So you know your vertex is at 2, negative 1, and there's your vertex. Okay? We also know our y-intercept. Our y-intercept is given to us in the equation. Our y-intercept is 3. So I can go ahead, so I have my vertex here. I have my y-intercept at 3. And that's only 2 points, but what I do know is that that y-intercept is 2 units away from my axis of symmetry, which means I also have a point 2 units away on the other side of my axis of symmetry. And that right there allows us to go ahead and graph our parabola. And you'll see when we graph it, we end up with something that looks like this. And that's what your graph would look like. Now you can always check it on your calculator. You can simply go ahead and put that into your calculator. Let me clear this out. If you go to y equals, make sure you clear out whatever else you have in there. I'm just going to go ahead and put this equation in. I have x squared minus 4x plus 3. Okay. And if I were to graph that, whoops, you'll see that that looks exactly like what we just plotted. Another thing you can do is get the information of all these points from the table. And in your calculator, the calculator, when you put in that equation, it automatically creates a table of values. You can access that table by pressing the second key and the graph key, and that'll bring you to the table. At any point, if you're not sure of something, you can stop the video, go back and play this part again. But to get there, it's just second and then graph, and that brings you to the table. In that table, you'll see all the different x values and then the corresponding y values. And there's a couple of important things to note here. You can also find your zeros, right? The zeros are where you're crossing the x-axis. Let's first look on our graph and see where we're crossing the x-axis. We're crossing the x-axis here, and we're crossing the x-axis here. So we crossed at 1 and at 3. Those are our zeros, when x equals 1 and when x equals 3. You can get that information from your calculator from the table. If you scroll through your table and you find where y is 0, look at this corresponding x value when y is 0, x is 1. When y is 0 here, x is 3. Okay, so you can find those zeros simply by going to the table of values in your calculator. So that's one method to finding the zeros. Just get all the information out of the calculator. You'll notice on the assignment it has you fill in the table of values for the problem. You can get that right out of the calculator. Again, to get to here, you just hit second graph, and that'll take you to the table. Now, the other way, or another way to find the zeros, is by factoring to solve it. I'm going to use that same exact equation just so you can see how it works out to be exactly the same. So our equation was y equals x squared minus 4x plus 3. So to find the zeros, I'm just going to set that equal to 0. And then I'm going to factor. Remember, I need two numbers that add to -4 and multiply to +3. So if you think about your factors of 3, your only factors are 1 and 3. But somehow I have to add those together to add to -4. And the only way to get 1 and 3 to add to -4 is to make both of them negative. So if I set up my two sets of parentheses, I have x and x. I have x minus 1 and x minus 3. Okay, I'm going to use -1 and -3 because they add to -4, but they also multiply to +3. When you multiply a negative by a negative, you get a positive number. And now we can apply our zero product rule. Our zero product rule says this. If I have two numbers that multiply to 0, one of them has to be equal to 0. Either A is going to be 0 or B is going to be 0. But when I'm looking at it like this, I have no idea which one is actually 0. So I have to assume that they both could be 0. Right? So A could be 0 and B could be 0. I'm going to apply that here. I have two numbers multiplied together. X minus 1 is something and x minus 3 is another something. Those are my factors per se, right? So I'm going to set each of those equal to 0 because I don't know which one is 0. It could be that they're both 0. I don't know, but I know at least one of them has to be if when I multiply them together I get 0. So I'm going to set each of them equal to 0 and then solve that equation. And I get x equals 1 and x equals 3, which is the same exact thing I got up here when I solved it by graphing. So you should always get the same answer whether you're solving it by graphing or solving it by factoring. Okay? Another thing to be careful of when, just a couple quick little things, when you are factoring, if you have something that looks like this, g of x is equal to -x squared minus 5x plus 6. Okay, if you have something like that and you have to solve it by factoring, just remember you still start the same way. You always set it equal to 0. But it's really hard to factor with that negative out in front. I don't like to do it, and I'm a math teacher. So what I would do is I would get rid of it, and by doing that you make it very easy. The way that you do it is you just take -1 out of each of your terms. So what happens is all of your terms end up changing signs. So this was -x squared, now it's +x squared. This was -5x, now it's +5x. This was +6, now it's -6. Remember, whatever I do to one side of my equation, I have to do to the other. So I'm going to divide both sides by -1 to get rid of that -1. 0 divided by anything is still just 0. So now I have x squared plus 5x minus 6 equals 0. And now it's a very straightforward problem to go ahead and solve. I'm going to find two numbers that add to 5 and multiply to -6. My only factors of 6 are 2 and 3 or 1 and 6. But I have to multiply to -6. So these can't both be positive, so I can't use 2 and 3 even though I know they add to 5. However, I can use +6 and -1. That multiplies to -6, but it also adds to +5. If I set each of my factors equal to 0, then I will end up with my solutions. So I get x equals -6 and x equals 1. We can also work backwards. Sometimes they will give us our roots. And I'm actually going to go right back to this problem here, and I'm just going to work it in reverse. So let's say I know my roots are 1 and 3. That means that x equals 1 and x equals 3. So I'm literally just working backwards. If x equals 1 and I subtract 1 from both sides, I end up with x minus 1 is equal to 0. If I work backwards here and subtract 3 from both sides, I end up with x minus 3 equals 0. And there's my two factors. So now I can say, well, x minus 1 times x minus 3 must equal 0. And then I can go ahead and FOIL. So I end up with x squared minus 3x minus 1x plus 3 equals 0. I can combine my like terms. So I end up with x squared minus 4x plus 3 equals 0. All I did was worked in reverse. Okay? When I say FOIL, that's just a way to remember to distribute twice. You're distributing the x to both terms over here, and then you're distributing the -1 to both terms over here. So that's how you would go about doing those problems. If you're given the roots, just work backwards. If they ask you to factor it, then just work forwards. Okay? But there will be both of those types of questions on the assignment. If at any point you're not sure, you can go back and watch parts of this video or review the problems again. Stop it, maybe write it out, see if that helps you to understand it at all. Okay, hopefully this helped, and tomorrow in class you will be working on, or not in class, sorry Sebastian, tomorrow you will be doing the assignment that goes with this video. Okay, have a great one. Let me know if you have any questions. Take care, Sebastian. Bye-bye.